Night had not yet reached the capital of Orinth, but from the observation deck of the transit shuttle, the world below already looked dim beneath the shadow of the structure above it. The structure was called the Crown of Nations. It was not a station in the human sense. It was a ringed fortress of pale metal and black crystal, wide enough to eclipse oceans, old enough that no living species claimed to have built it, and important enough that half the galaxy pretended to respect it while quietly fearing the decisions made inside. It hung in high orbit like a verdict carved into the sky. Commander Elias Varin stood near the forward glass with his hands locked behind his back, watching the crown grow larger as the shuttle approached. Its outer hull shimmered in long bands of silver light, and thousands of docking corridors branched from it like veins from the heart of something too ancient to die. Behind him, the shuttle cabin was silent except for the low pulse of the drive core. Ambassador Celine Ward sat across from the main aisle, reading the assembly docket from a thin blue projection sheet. Her face gave away nothing. It never did. Even under bad news, she had the composure of someone who believed panic was just another form of laziness. Beside her, legal advisor Dr. Ilian Ross was moving through a stack of archive treaties with the speed and irritation of a man already finding errors in documents he had not yet finished reading. At the rear of the cabin, Communications Officer June Mercer broke the silence first. "So," he said, trying and failing to sound casual, "if 16 delegations requested emergency review in under 2 days, that means this is coordinated, right?" "No," Celine said without looking up. "It means they want us to know it's coordinated." June let out a breath through his nose. "That is somehow worse." Elias turned from the glass and crossed the cabin with slow, measured steps. He lowered himself into the vacant seat beside the central table, eyes moving once across the docket hovering above it. Emergency petition regarding unlawful expansion in the Ashfall corridor. He read the line twice, not because he needed to, but because there was something offensive in how cleanly it was phrased. Unlawful expansion. As if the farms, foundries, schools, and half-built homes in Ashfall had appeared there by accident. As if the people who had crossed 6 years of deep route space to settle those worlds were trespassers instead of citizens. As if a phrase written in polished diplomatic language could make theft sound procedural. The shuttle gave a soft mechanical shudder as it aligned with the outer dock. June leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do we know who started it?" Celine folded the projection sheet at last and let it vanish into the table. "The Karate Combine submitted the petition," she said. "But they didn't write it alone." "That many signatures?" June asked. "No," Elias spoke this time, his voice flat. "That much confidence." Nobody answered him. Through the side ports, the first layers of the Crown's docking architecture came into view, long black spines of alloy, enormous pressure gates, rotating signal arrays shedding pale gold light into the dark. Human stations were built for function first. This place had been designed to impress, then intimidate, then remind visitors that both impressions had been intentional. The docking clamps took hold with a heavy metallic thud. A tone chimed overhead. "Transit complete. Assembly guests prepare for formal entry." June muttered, "Formal entry. They really can't help themselves." Celine rose first, smoothing the front of her slate-gray coat. "Keep your expression neutral once we step out." June blinked. "I always keep my expression neutral." "No," Elias said, standing, "you keep your expression honest. That's different." For the first time in nearly an hour, Celine almost smiled. The airlock opened. Cold, filtered air slid into the cabin carrying the faint scent of mineral vapor and machine ozone. Beyond the hatch waited a receiving corridor so wide it could have held a parade. The floor was a dark reflective stone veined with silver. The ceiling arched high overhead in layered geometric panels that seemed to glow from within. Along the walls stood silent attendants from species Elias could not immediately name, draped in ceremonial garments or armored skins or polished exoshells that marked status in ways humanity had not yet learned to read. He hated places like this. Not because they were alien. He had spent 20 years in alien places. Not because they were beautiful. This one was beautiful in the same way a blade was beautiful. He hated them because every line, every sound, Every deliberate piece of scale had been chosen to make one thing clear. Someone else belonged here more than you did. The human delegation moved together down the corridor, their footsteps swallowed by the polished floor. Far ahead, where the main passage opened into the interior sectors of the station, groups of other delegates were already converging on the central halls. Elias caught flashes of color and movement, crimson cloaks from the Karate, glass thread robes worn by the serene houses, the low clicking speech of Talran envoys traveling in a cluster around floating record drones. Nobody approached the humans directly, but many looked. Some with curiosity, some with careful indifference, some with the restrained, almost satisfied focus of people arriving early to witness a public correction. June noticed it too. Elias could tell by the way the younger man's jaw tightened as they passed a cluster of observers near a junction arch. "They're enjoying this," June murmured. Celine kept walking. "Of course they are." Dr. Ross adjusted the case tucked under his arm. "They think this will be simple." Elias glanced at him. "Will it?" Ross looked up at the vaulted ceiling and then ahead again. "Simple for them," he said. The inner transit lifted them through 3 security rings and deposited them near the upper administrative level. By the time they reached the final corridor leading toward the assembly chamber, the station's artificial light had shifted from pale silver to a muted white-blue, signaling the official opening of session hours. At the far end of the passage stood the doors. They were enormous, twin slabs of dark composite framed by a ring of old gold metal etched with diplomatic seals from hundreds of civilizations, some still alive, some extinct, some broken and absorbed by the very institution whose marks were engraved there. The doors were not merely an entrance. They were a warning disguised as history. Celine stopped a few paces short of them. The others stopped too. For a moment no one spoke. The muffled sound of the chamber beyond carried through the seams, layered translator tones, distant formal announcements, movement from hundreds of seated bodies preparing for session. June swallowed. Maybe they only want to scare us. Ross gave him a look. 16 delegations don't force an emergency hearing to scare anyone. Celine turned to Elias. "You've been quiet." "I'm thinking." "About the petition?" He looked at the sealed chamber doors. "No," he said. "About the outcome." June frowned. "We haven't even gone inside yet." Elias kept his gaze on the doors. "That's exactly why I'm thinking about it now." Celine studied him for a second, then folded her hands behind her back. "Say it." He did not answer immediately. He listened to the chamber noise beyond the metal, to the weight of the station around them, to the ritual of the place preparing to call itself fair before doing something permanent. Then he said, "This isn't a hearing." June stared at him. Ross said nothing. Celine's face remained calm, but her eyes sharpened slightly. "What is it then?" Elias finally turned from the doors and met her gaze. "A ceremony," he said. "They just haven't read the sentence yet." No one replied after that. The chamber attendants moved toward the entrance positions. Locks disengaged one by one inside the frame with a sequence of heavy internal clicks. The doors began to open, and the delegation from Earth walked forward into the light. The chamber was already full. Rows upon rows of elevated platforms curved inward toward a central floor of dark stone, forming a vast circular arena where every seat had a clear line of sight. The scale was deliberate. Nothing spoken here was meant to be private, and nothing decided here was meant to be small. As Elias stepped onto the main floor behind Ambassador Celine Ward, he felt the weight of attention settle across the human delegation like a physical pressure. Not loud, not obvious, but everywhere. Above them, layered rings of seating were occupied by representatives of more than 100 civilizations. Some leaned forward. Some remained still as statues. Others whispered quietly into translation nodes that glowed faintly at their throats or wrists. The chamber's air carried a subtle sweetness, artificial, engineered, something meant to calm, to steady, to reduce volatility. Elias recognized it immediately. Control disguised as courtesy. The Karate use airborne stabilizers in mixed-species environments, Ross murmured under his breath. Mild cognitive dampening. Not enough to impair judgment. just enough to soften reactions. June made a face. That's comforting. Celine didn't react. She moved with steady precision toward the designated seating sector for Earth, third ring from the outer boundary, positioned slightly below the midpoint of the chamber's vertical tiers. Not the lowest. Not anywhere near the center. A reminder. Elias took his seat beside her, resting his forearms lightly on the table as he scanned the chamber. The karate delegation occupied a central tier, elevated above most others. Their robes shimmered with faint iridescent patterns, their posture rigid with ceremonial importance. They had positioned themselves well. They always did. A low tone resonated through the chamber. The noise faded almost instantly. At the highest point of the inner ring, a single figure rose. The presiding arbiter. It was difficult to assign the being a human frame of reference. Tall, elongated, its form draped in layered fabric that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of the light. Its face, if it could be called that, was partially obscured by a translucent veil through which faint points of light pulsed slowly. Ancient, measured, untouched by urgency. When it spoke, its voice did not echo. It carried. Emergency Session 7391 is now in order. The translation came a fraction of a second later in the human auditory channel, smooth and precise. The matter before this assembly concerns the Ashfall corridor and the conduct of the Terran delegation in relation to its settlement. Elias felt June shift beside him. 16 delegations. 16 signatures. And every eye in the room was now on them. The Karate Combine, the arbiter continued, has submitted a formal resolution supported by multiple signatories. The assembly will hear the charges in full before responses are granted. A movement from the central tier. One of the karate delegates rose. It was taller than most of its kind, its 4 upper limbs folded neatly across its torso while 2 lower appendages anchored it to the platform. A thin band of light circled its neck, its translator, and flickered once before stabilizing. When it spoke, the voice that emerged was sharp, clean, and perfectly controlled. Honored Assembly, it began, we bring before you a matter not of dispute, but of necessary correction. June leaned slightly toward Elias. Not a great start. Elias didn't answer. The karate delegate continued. For 6 standard cycles, the Terran species has expanded into the region designated as the Ashfall corridor. During that time, they have established permanent settlements, constructed industrial infrastructure, and initiated large-scale resource extraction. Each phrase landed cleanly, deliberately, built to sound reasonable. They have done so, the delegate said, without regard for existing stabilizing agreements governing transit-adjacent territories, without consultation with neighboring systems, and without recognition of the broader equilibrium maintained within this sector of the galaxy. Ross's fingers tightened slightly around his data case. Stabilizing agreements? He whispered. That's not even. Celine lifted one hand, just slightly. The karate delegate did not pause. Furthermore, it continued, their actions have introduced volatility into an already sensitive corridor. Trade flow has been disrupted. Migration patterns, documented and undocumented, have been affected. Resource fields of uncertain classification have been exploited without certification or oversight. A low murmur spread through parts of the chamber. Agreement, or the appearance of it. Elias watched the reactions carefully. Some delegates nodded. Some didn't move. Some watched the humans instead of the speaker. That was more important. The karate lifted one of its upper limbs. With these concerns in mind, the Combine, supported by its co-signatories, submits the following resolution. June stopped breathing for a second. Elias noticed. It meant he understood what was coming. The Terran delegation is to initiate full withdrawal from all settlements within the Ashfall corridor within 1 galactic cycle. There was final, non-negotiable in tone, even before discussion began. All constructed infrastructure, the delegate continued, is to be dismantled or transferred to assembly oversight. Resource extraction is to cease immediately pending formal review. Ross exhaled slowly through his nose. Celine remained completely still. Elias felt something settle in his chest, not surprise, not anger. Recognition. They knew, he thought. They knew this was coming. And, the karate said, voice unchanged, in recognition of unauthorized exploitation, the Terran government will provide reparations proportional to assessed extraction impact. June whispered, "You've got to be." Celine's hand moved again. So, the final part came without emphasis. Because it didn't need any. Until such terms are fulfilled, all Terran trade access through assembly-regulated corridors will be suspended. Silence. Not the soft kind. The heavy kind. The kind that comes when everyone understands exactly what was just said. No trade corridors. No fuel exchanges. No medical imports. No navigation relays. Not an attack. Something worse. A slow suffocation. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes moving across the chamber. This was not about ashfall. Not really. This was about pressure. About forcing a decision. About reminding a young species how power actually worked. Around them, the chamber began to stir. Delegates shifted. Whispers rose. A representative from a distant outer system spoke briefly in support. Then another. And another. Not long speeches. Short affirmations. Carefully worded. But all leaning in the same direction. June swallowed. They lined this up. Ross nodded faintly. Of course they did. Celine finally moved. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, posture straight, expression composed. Elias glanced at her. Nothing. No anger. No fear. No visible reaction at all. Only focus. The arbiter raised one elongated hand. The chamber quieted again. The charges have been presented, it said. Supporting statements will be heard before the Terran delegation is granted response. Elias let his gaze drift upward toward the higher tiers. 16 delegations. More speaking now. One mentioned regional imbalance. Another, precedent concerns. A third spoke for nearly 10 minutes about interconnected transit sensitivities, without once saying anything that actually mattered. Noise. Structured noise. Designed to make the outcome feel justified. June leaned closer, voice barely audible. This is a setup. Elias didn't look at him. Yes, he said quietly. June waited. So what do we do? Elias watched as another delegate rose to speak against them, calm, measured, already certain of the ending. He thought of the colonies in Ashfall. Of the settlements built in dust and iron. Of people who had signed contracts, boarded ships, and crossed empty space because they believed unclaimed meant something. Then he looked back at the chamber. At the tiers. At the center. At the structure of it all. And he said, just loud enough for Celine to hear, "They've already decided." Celine didn't turn her head. Didn't acknowledge him directly. But after a moment, she said, "Then we make sure they have to listen first." The chamber continued its careful, orderly movement toward a conclusion that had been written long before the humans arrived. And for the first time since stepping inside, Elias understood exactly what kind of fight this was going to be. Not a fight to be right. A fight to be heard anyway. By the time the chamber granted the Terran delegation the floor, nearly 3 hours had passed. 3 hours of carefully measured concern. 3 hours of polished language that circled the same conclusion from different angles. 3 hours of agreement disguised as discussion. Elias had not spoken once. Neither had Celine. Ross had taken notes, real ones, not for record, but for precision. June had stopped reacting halfway through the second hour and now sat still, eyes forward, absorbing everything. They had let it happen. That mattered. Because now, when the silence came, it belonged to them. The arbiter inclined its head slightly. The assembly recognizes the Terran delegation for formal response. Every sound in the chamber dropped away. Celine stood. No rush. No visible tension. Just a smooth, controlled movement that drew attention without asking for it. Honored Assembly, she began, her voice clear and level in the common trade channel, we acknowledge the concerns raised here today. And we thank you for the opportunity to address them directly. June blinked once. Elias didn't. Polite. Measured. Exactly what they expected. That was the point. Celine turned slightly, giving a brief nod toward Ross. Dr. Ross. Ross rose immediately, already activating the projection field. Above the central floor, a wide lattice of light unfolded into a full holographic display, layered data, maps, archival stamps, certification codes. Organized. Impossible to ignore. The Ashfall corridor, Ross began, was first surveyed 412 standard cycles ago by the Assembly's own exploratory division. The first image stabilized. A document. Verified. The insignia at the bottom belonged not to Earth, but to the Karate Combine. A faint shift moved through their delegation tier. Ross continued without pause. The survey classified all systems within the corridor as uninhabited, unmaintained, and unclaimed. No permanent settlements. No active governance. No registered territorial interest. He let the image linger just long enough, then moved on. A secondary survey conducted 109 cycles later confirmed the same findings. Another document. Another stamp. Another confirmation. Elias watched the chamber. Small reactions. Subtle. But spreading. Ross adjusted the display again. This classification is relevant, he said, because it directly activates Article 9 of the Assembly Charter, Settlement Rights in Unclaimed Space. The text appeared above them. Full clause. Original language. Trade translation beneath it. Ross did not paraphrase. He read it exactly as written. When a region has been formally surveyed and recorded as unclaimed, any member species may establish settlement within that region, provided no competing claim is filed within one full galactic cycle following survey certification. Silence. Not complete. But different now. Sharper. Listening. Ross let the words settle before continuing. No claim was filed on the Ashfall corridor. He shifted the display. Timeline. Unbroken. No claim was filed within one cycle. Another shift. Still nothing. No claim was filed within 10 cycles. Another. No claim was filed within 100 cycles. The final image locked into place. 400 cycles. Empty. Unchallenged. Unclaimed. By the Assembly's own charter, Ross said calmly, the Ashfall corridor has remained open for lawful settlement for over 4 centuries. Elias saw it then. The first real fracture. Not in the argument. In the room. Several delegates leaned back. Others looked toward the karate tier. Some simply stopped moving. Ross continued. Terran exploration vessels entered the corridor 6 standard cycles ago. Map overlay. Human routes. Clean lines across empty systems. Initial settlement began shortly thereafter. All development, industrial, agricultural, and residential, has occurred within regions previously certified as unclaimed under Assembly law. He turned slightly. Not toward the arbiter. Toward the chamber. We did not expand illegally, he said. A small pause. We expanded within the framework this Assembly established. The words did not rise. They didn't need to. June shifted beside Elias, barely containing the reaction. They're hitting them with their own rules, he whispered. Elias didn't respond. He was watching the karate. Their posture had not changed. But the stillness was different now. Tighter. Controlled. Ross continued, moving through additional layers of data. Colony population records. Infrastructure development timelines. Resource extraction logs. Every number sourced. Every claim documented. Every line anchored to something older than the accusation itself. Concerns regarding unauthorized resource use, Ross said, are similarly unsupported. All extraction sites were established following geological surveys conducted by Terran science teams, with full archival submission to the Assembly database. Another shift. Coordinates. Certification records. Distances from any registered points of interest. The nearest site of cultural or geological significance referenced in today's statements lies over 600 kilometers from the closest Terran operation. The pause. Those surveys, he added, were completed before a single drill was placed. That one landed. Elias felt it in the room. Not loudly, but clearly. June exhaled slowly. That's not even close. Ross didn't acknowledge the reaction. He simply stepped back slightly. Finished. The data remained above the chamber, silent and complete. Celine stepped forward again. She did not rush to fill the silence. She let it exist. Let them sit with it. Then she spoke. The Assembly Charter was written to prevent conflict over unclaimed space, she said. It established a clear process. A fair process. One that allowed any member species, old or new, to build, provided they followed the rules. She gestured lightly toward the projection. We followed them. Her gaze moved across the chamber. Not confrontational. Not pleading. Steady. Every settlement in Ashfall was established legally. Every structure built under the authority of your own charter. Every action taken within the framework you created. A faint movement in the upper tiers. Not agreement, but discomfort. Celine saw it. Continued anyway. If there are concerns about how that framework applies in evolving circumstances, she said, we are prepared to discuss them. We are prepared to adapt where adaptation is justified. Another pause. But we will not accept the claim that we violated rules we have demonstrably followed. That line held. Uncomplicated. Elias felt something shift again. Not victory. Not yet. But pressure, moving in the opposite direction. From the center outward. For the first time since the session began, the human delegation was not being pushed. They were pushing back. And doing it without raising their voices. The Arbiter inclined its head slightly. The Assembly acknowledges the Terran response. A small movement. Clarifying statements may be raised. There was. The opening. A karate delegate rose immediately. Faster than before. More controlled. But less comfortable. The cited charter clause, it said, was intended to govern deep space regions beyond active transit corridors. The Ashfall corridor exists adjacent to multiple established trade routes. Celine didn't move. Ross didn't interrupt. Elias leaned slightly forward. Here it comes. The karate continued, and therefore cannot be reasonably interpreted under the same classification as isolated, unconnected space. Celine turned her head slightly toward Ross. Ross stepped forward again. Please indicate, he said calmly, where that distinction exists in Article 9. Silence. The karate did not answer immediately. Because it couldn't. Ross didn't press. He didn't need to. He simply held the space. And in that space, the absence of an answer said everything. Elias watched the chamber. That was the moment. The first real crack. Not in policy. In confidence. June whispered, barely containing it, they didn't think we'd come with this. Elias finally allowed himself the smallest shift in posture. Not relaxed. But grounded. No, he said quietly. They didn't. The chamber settled again. But it was no longer the same chamber they had walked into. Because now, for the first time, the outcome didn't feel completely certain. And everyone in the room knew it. For a moment, it almost looked like it had worked. Not victory, but disruption. The chamber no longer moved with the same smooth inevitability it had before. Conversations broke out in tighter clusters. Delegates who had spent the last 3 hours nodding in quiet agreement were now leaning toward one another, speaking in lower tones, glancing more often toward the Terran tier than the karate. The projection still hovered above the central floor. Unanswered. Undisputed. And that mattered. June exhaled slowly beside Elias. They don't have a response, he whispered. Elias didn't answer immediately. He was watching the Arbiter. Watching how long it allowed the silence to exist. Watching how long the system tolerated uncertainty. That was where the real decision would be made. Not in the argument. In how the argument was handled. The Arbiter raised one elongated hand. The chamber quieted again. Smooth. Effortless. As if the last several minutes had been nothing more than a minor interruption. The Assembly has reviewed the Terran response, it said. No emotion. No acknowledgement of what had just happened. Just process. As previously stated, the matter before this body concerns not only legal interpretation, but the preservation of systemic stability across active transit regions. There was. Elias felt it click into place. They were shifting the ground. Not contesting the facts. Redefining the frame. Celine didn't move. Ross's expression tightened slightly, but he said nothing. The arbiter continued. While the Terran delegation has demonstrated compliance with the explicit language of Article 9, multiple member states have raised valid concerns regarding the broader implications of rapid expansion within sensitive corridors. June blinked. Wait, what? Elias spoke quietly. They're conceding the law. June turned. Then we win. Elias didn't look at him. No, he said. Now they decide it doesn't matter. At the central tier, another delegate rose, this one from a mid-level trade coalition, its voice softer, more measured. The issue is not whether the Terran species followed the letter of the charter, it said. The issue is whether the charter, as written, adequately protects existing equilibrium when applied to modern conditions. Murmurs. Agreement. Careful. Incremental. Another delegate followed. Unregulated expansion at this scale introduces risk. Not through intent, but through consequence. A third. Precedent must be considered. If one species accelerates beyond the established pace, others will follow. Instability becomes inevitable. Ross leaned slightly toward Celine. They're building a narrative. Celine's eyes remained on the chamber. Yes. Not resisting. Absorbing. That was worse. Because it meant the decision wasn't reacting to the evidence. It was moving around it. Elias felt the shift solidify. The facts had done their job. They had proven something important. Something undeniable. And it had changed nothing. The arbiter spoke again. The assembly must consider not only legality, but continuity. Not only rights, but balance. June let out a quiet, disbelieving breath. So they're just ignoring it? No, Elias said. They're using it. June frowned. Using it for what? Elias watched as another delegate rose to speak in favor of the resolution. For justification, he said. And then it happened. The vote was called. Not delayed. Not debated further. Called. As if the discussion phase had already served its purpose. Celine's posture did not change. Ross went completely still. June stared at the central platform like he hadn't processed what he was hearing. One by one, the votes began. Affirmative. The pause. Another voice. Affirmative. The automated register recorded each one in a neutral tone that made the outcome feel mechanical. Inevitable. Affirmative. Elias counted without meaning to. Not numbers. Patterns. Which delegations voted early? Which waited? Which glanced toward others before committing? The karate block moved first. Confident. Synchronized. Others followed. Some quickly. Some with hesitation that lasted less than a second. June leaned forward. They can't just, after all that. They can, Ross said quietly. They are. More votes. Affirmative. 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 A few abstentions. Carefully placed. Signals without risk. Elias's gaze shifted upward. He saw it now. What this had always been. Not a question of right and wrong. A question of alignment. Who depended on whom? Who what? Who could afford to disagree? The answer was written in the vote before it was finished. The final tally appeared above the chamber. 41 in favor. 7 abstentions. 3 against. And 2 outer systems that had nothing to lose. The resolution passed. No ceremony. No emphasis. Just a quiet entry into the record. As determined by the assembly, the arbiter said, the Terran delegation is hereby required to initiate withdrawal procedures from the Ashfall corridor within 1 galactic cycle. Enforcement provisions will activate in accordance with trade compliance protocols. June sat back slowly, like something had been knocked out of him. Ross closed his data case without looking at it. Celine remained seated, still composed, still unreadable. Elias felt something settle inside him. Not anger, not shock. Something colder. Recognition. They were never trying to win the argument, he thought. They were trying to make sure it didn't matter. Around them, the chamber began to shift again. Not loudly, but with a different energy. Less tension. More completion. Delegates leaning back. Conversations restarting. The sense of a process concluded. June spoke again, quieter now. So that's it. No one answered him. Because they all understood the same thing at the same time. This had never been about whether humanity was right. It had been about whether humanity could be made to accept being overruled. Celine finally moved. She placed both hands flat on the table for a moment. Not in frustration. In thought. Then she looked forward, toward the central floor. They'll open the floor for final statements, she said. Ross nodded faintly. Procedure. June let out a hollow breath. After this? Yes, Elias said. He was still watching the chamber. Watching how easily it returned to order. How quickly it absorbed what had just happened. How do you make a decision like that, and just move on? June asked. Elias didn't answer right away. Then he said, by deciding it was never really a decision. The arbiter raised its hand once more. The resolution has been entered into record. The assembly will now proceed to closing formalities. Final statements may be made. Silence settled again. Different this time. Not anticipatory. Routine. This part didn't matter. It never did. No one spoke during final statements. There was no reason to. The outcome was already sealed. June looked down at the table. Ross stared straight ahead. Celine did not move. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair. And for the first time since they had entered the chamber, he stopped thinking about the argument. Stopped thinking about the law. Stopped thinking about what they had proven. Because none of it had changed the only thing that mattered. Power. He looked once more at the chamber. At the tears. At the delegates who had just voted to erase 500,000 lives with clean language and procedural calm. And then, very quietly, he started thinking about something else. Not how to win the argument. But what to do when winning it isn't enough. The chamber had already moved on. That was the strangest part. The resolution had been passed, recorded, and absorbed into the endless machinery of the assembly with barely more weight than a routine adjustment. Conversations resumed in low, controlled tones. Delegates shifted in their seats. Data feeds updated. Procedure continued. As if nothing irreversible had just happened. The arbiter's voice carried once more. Final statements may be entered into the record. No one stood. They never did. Final statements were a formality, a ceremonial pause before closure. A moment that existed not for change, but for tradition. June leaned slightly toward Elias, his voice low. That's it then. Ross didn't look at him. Yes. Celine remained seated, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Composed. Already processing what came next. Elias watched the chamber. Watched how easily it returned to equilibrium. Watched how the weight of the decision seemed to belong only to the people it affected. He thought of ashfall. Of the settlements scattered across dry plains and iron ridges. Of families who had built something from nothing because the law had told them they could. Of people who were not in this room. Who would never be in this room. And yet, everything about their lives had just been decided here. Cleanly. Quietly. Without them. Elias exhaled once. Then he stood. The movement was not dramatic. No sudden gesture. No raised voice. Just a simple act. One man rising from his seat in a moment where no one else intended to. But it broke the pattern. And the chamber felt it. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. The arbiter's gaze shifted downward, focusing on the Terran tier. June went rigid. Elias, he whispered. Celine did not stop him. That mattered more than anything. Elias stepped forward. Not to the central platform. Not fully. Just enough to be seen. Enough to be heard. I will enter a statement, he said. His voice was even. Not loud. But it carried. A ripple moved through the chamber. Not outrage. Not yet. Something closer to uncertainty. The arbiter regarded him for a long moment. The Terran delegation has concluded its formal response, it said. Additional statements are not required. Elias met its gaze. This one is. Silence. A different kind now. Sharper. More focused. The arbiter paused. Then after a moment, proceed. Elias didn't thank it. He didn't acknowledge the permission. He simply spoke. The Terran delegation does not recognize the legitimacy of a resolution shaped by coordinated pressure rather than impartial review. The words landed clean. Uncomplicated. The chamber reacted immediately, movement, shifting, low bursts of overlapping speech from multiple translation channels. Elias didn't stop. In the Ashfall corridor, he continued, there are currently over 400,000 Terran civilians. He let the number sit. Not as a statistic. As a weight. Families. Workers. Children born on those worlds. People who built homes under the assumption that the laws of this assembly meant something. June's hands tightened on the edge of the table. Ross remained still. Celine watched. Elias's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. No resolution passed in this chamber will remove them. That did it. The reaction surged, louder this time. Delegates speaking over one another, some in protest, others in sharp, rapid consultation. The chamber's calm fractured. A karate delegate stood abruptly. This statement constitutes direct refusal of assembly authority. Elias turned his head slightly. Looked at him. Just for a second. Then continued. If any force is dispatched to enforce relocation within the Ashfall corridor, he said, it will encounter Terran assets currently stationed in proximity to that region. The words were precise. Measured. Deliberately incomplete. June closed his eyes briefly. Ross inhaled once, slow and controlled. Celine did not move. Elias didn't elaborate. Didn't describe those assets. Didn't name them. Didn't have to. The implication filled the silence that followed. And for the first time since the session began, the chamber went completely still. Not procedural silence. Not polite quiet. Something colder. Something calculating. The karate delegate spoke again, sharper now. You are issuing a threat in violation of assembly conduct. Elias looked at him again. Longer this time. It's not a threat, he said. The pause. Calmly. It's a condition. That line didn't echo. It didn't need to. It settled into the room like something solid. The arbiter raised its hand. Order. Slowly, reluctantly, the noise died down. Elias stepped back. Returned to his place without waiting for acknowledgement. June stared straight ahead, barely breathing. Ross kept his eyes on the table. Celine remained composed, but there was something different now. Not emotion. Decision. She reached forward. Placed her hand on the physical copy of the resolution resting on the table in front of them. A ceremonial document. Pale material. Bound. To. Final. She lifted it. Turned it over. Face down. The motion was small. Quiet. But unmistakable. Then she stood. Smoothed the front of her coat once. And walked toward the exit. No announcement. No explanation. Elias rose immediately and followed. Ross after him. June hesitated for half a second, then stood and joined them. One by one, the Terran delegation left their seats. 12 figures. Moving in a single, silent line. The chamber watched. No one stopped them. No one spoke. The doors opened. They walked through. And behind them, they closed. So, final. Inside the chamber, the silence held longer this time. Because something had changed. Not the resolution. Not the record. Something else. Something harder to define. At the central tier, the karate delegates were already speaking in tight, urgent tones. Across the upper levels, smaller delegations sat very still. Watching the doors. Not looking away. The arbiter remained motionless. Its gaze resting on the empty space the Terran delegation had left behind. And for the first time since the session began, the outcome no longer felt complete. The footage left the chamber before the doors finished closing. It did not pass through official channels. It did not wait for clearance. It simply moved. Across independent relays, private feeds, unsecured observation networks, and every journalist who understood instinctively that something had just happened that did not belong to a closed room. Within minutes, the image was everywhere. A single Terran officer standing during final statements. A calm voice refusing recognition. An unfinished sentence about military assets. An ambassador turning the resolution face down. 12 people walking out without permission. No shouting. No chaos. No apology. Just departure. On the outer colonies of Ashfall, people watched it in silence. In mining stations where the air tasted like metal and dust, screens flickered with the same sequence on repeat. In small residential modules where families had gathered for evening meals, conversations stopped halfway through as the transmission played. No commentary was needed. Everyone understood. They weren't leaving. On Orinth, in the orbital lanes beneath the crown, private channels filled with clipped transmissions, requests for confirmation, questions without answers, analysts replaying the footage frame by frame. Did they just refuse compliance? That wasn't just refusal. What was it then? A signal. In the assembly itself, the reaction fractured along invisible lines. Publicly, the response was immediate and controlled. Formal objections were filed within the hour. Statements were issued condemning the Terran delegation's breach of procedural conduct. The Karate Combine called for disciplinary review. The language was precise, measured, predictable. Privately, it was something else entirely. Elias sat in the delegation quarters, watching the same footage for the third time without really seeing it. Across the room, June paced. Not nervously, restlessly, like his body hadn't caught up to what had just happened. They're going to escalate this, he said. They have to. Elias, we walked out on a sealed resolution. Ross stood near the central console, pulling data streams into alignment. Correction, he said without looking up. We refuse to validate it. June stopped pacing. That's not better. Celine sat at the far end of the room, reading. Not the footage. Messages. They were coming in faster now. Not through official assembly channels. Those were quiet. Too quiet. These came through secondary routes. Encrypted side links. Intermediary relays. Back channels that didn't exist on record. She read each one carefully. Said nothing. Elias finally looked up. How many? Celine didn't answer immediately. 17. June blinked. 17 what? Delegations. June stared at her. 17 delegations are contacting us? Not officially, she said. They're asking questions. Quietly. Ross glanced over. About what? Celine met his eyes. About what happens next. That landed. Harder than anything that had happened in the chamber. Because it meant one thing. They weren't certain anymore. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair. Across the station, in a secured advisory chamber reserved for Karate Internal Council, the tone was very different. No formality. No measured diplomacy. Just urgency. You allowed that statement to stand, one voice said sharply. The Karate lead delegate remained still. The arbiter allowed it. You did not contest it strongly enough. It was contested. Not effectively. The pause. Then another voice, quieter, more controlled. What matters is not the statement itself, it said. It is whether they can act on it. Silence followed that. Because everyone in the room understood the implication. A data display activated at the center of the chamber. Fleet registry logs. Assembly monitored. Public. Accurate. Terran naval presence, the quieter voice continued, currently includes one active deployment group in proximity to the Ashfall corridor. One of the others exhaled. One fleet is not. It is not one fleet, the voice corrected. The display shifted. Additional entries. Movement logs. Transit registrations. Not hidden. Not masked. Declared. 3 additional Terran fleet groups have initiated standard transit toward the Ashfall region. Another pause. Longer this time. Standard transit? Someone asked. Yes. No stealth. No. No concealment? No. The room went still. Because that changed the meaning. They weren't sneaking. They weren't preparing quietly. They were letting it be seen. Elias sat forward slightly as Ross brought up the same data on their own screen. June stared at it. They're not even trying to hide it, he said. Ross shook his head. They want it logged. Celine finally looked up from her messages. Of course they do, she said. June looked between them. Why? Elias answered. Because hidden movement can be denied, he said. Visible movement has to be answered. June frowned slowly. They're forcing a reaction. Yes. Ross added, or forcing hesitation. That was the real play. Back in the Karate Advisory Chamber, the implications were being calculated in real time. The Terran species is attempting deterrence, one voice said. They lack the authority to enforce it. They may not need authority. Another pause. They are assuming we will not risk escalation. They are testing that assumption. The quieter voice spoke again. Can we enforce the resolution without direct confrontation? No one answered immediately, because now the question had changed. Not, are they right? Not, do we have support? But, can we do this without starting something we cannot control? That was a different calculation. A harder one. Across the station, in observation galleries and diplomatic quarters, the same recalculation was happening in smaller, quieter ways. A mid-tier delegation paused before submitting a follow-up statement. Then didn't. Another delayed a scheduled public endorsement. A third sent a message, unofficial, untraceable, requesting clarification on Terran intentions. Celine read that one twice. Then archived it without responding. June watched her. We're not answering them? Not yet. Why not? She looked at him. Because right now, she said, they're trying to figure out which way things are moving. June hesitated. And if we answer? We make it easier for them. Ross nodded faintly. Ambiguity works in our favor. Elias stood and moved toward the viewport. From this angle, the crown's outer structure filled most of the sky. But beyond it, faint, distant, he could see them. Points of light. Steady. Unmoving. Fleet markers. June joined him after a moment, squinting slightly. Those are ours. Elias nodded once. Third deployment group. June exhaled slowly. They're just sitting there. Yes. Waiting. Elias didn't answer immediately. No, he said. They're holding. June frowned. Difference. Elias kept his eyes on the distant lights. Waiting is passive, he said. Holding is a decision. Behind them, Celine stood. She closed the last of the incoming messages. For now, she said, we let this settle. Ross looked up. You think they'll move? Celine considered that. Then shook her head slightly. No. June looked back toward the viewport. They have to do something. Celine's voice was calm. They already did, she said. They passed the resolution. June blinked. That's not enough. No, Celine agreed. It isn't. A quiet pause settled over the room. Outside, the distant fleet lights didn't shift, didn't advance, didn't retreat. They simply remained. Visible. Registered. Impossible to ignore. Elias watched them for a long moment, then said quietly, It's already working. The request to reconvene did not come from the Karate. That was the first sign things had shifted. It came from 12 mid-tier delegations, submitted simultaneously through the Assembly's formal channel. Not powerful enough individually to dictate policy, but together, large enough to stall one. Large enough to matter. The reason listed was simple. Clarification of stability implications within the Ashfall corridor. No mention of humanity. No mention of the walkout. No mention of fleets. But everyone understood what it meant. The arbiter approved the session. It had no choice. The chamber filled more slowly this time. Less confidence. More caution. Delegates arrived in smaller groups, speaking quietly, pausing before taking their seats. The atmosphere was different, not tense, not hostile. Uncertain. Elias noticed it immediately. They're not sure how this goes, June murmured as they stepped through the doors. Elias nodded once. Celine did not head toward the outer ring. She didn't even glance at it. Instead, she walked straight across the chamber floor, toward the central table. June slowed slightly. That's not. Ross didn't stop. Elias didn't hesitate. Celine reached the table reserved for senior delegations, the inner circle of influence, where the oldest and most powerful species conducted primary negotiations. No one had invited them. No one had offered. But no rule explicitly denied it either. That was the kind of gap Celine used. She pulled out a seat, sat down, as if it had always been hers. Elias took the seat to her right, Ross to her left. June followed, a half-second behind the others, still processing what they had just done. Across the chamber, several delegates stopped mid-step, watching, calculating. No one challenged it. Not yet. At the highest tier, the arbiter entered. It paused. Not long. Just enough to take in the change. Then it moved to its position and called the session to order. The assembly recognizes the reconvening request, it said. Statements will be heard. One of the mid-tier delegates stood. A representative from a trade coalition that had abstained during the vote. Our concern, it said carefully, is not with the resolution itself, but with the potential consequences of its enforcement. Another followed. Escalation risks have increased. A third. Multiple parties have expressed uncertainty regarding implementation. No one said, Terran fleet. No one said, refusal. But the meaning was clear. We don't want this to turn into something worse. Celine listened to each statement without interruption. Without reaction. She let them speak. All of them. Because now, they needed her to. When the final speaker sat down, the chamber settled into a quiet that felt very different from the one before the vote. This one wasn't routine. It was waiting. Celine stood. From the central table. That mattered. The position spoke before she did. Members of the assembly, she began. No acknowledgement of the previous session. No reference to the walkout. No defense. She skipped all of it. Straight to control. The situation in the Ashfall corridor is not complex, she said. That alone drew attention. Because everything in this chamber was always described as complex. It has been made complex, she continued, by conflicting interests and delayed responses. But the underlying structure remains simple. She gestured slightly. Ross activated the projection. But this time, it wasn't evidence. It wasn't defense. It was a framework. Clean lines. Clear divisions. Defined zones. Under Article 9, Celine said, Terran settlements in Ashfall are legally established and remain so. No argument. Just a statement. Rather than revisiting that foundation, we propose to formalize it. The display shifted. A new layer. Highlighted regions. Permanent designation markers. Terran settlement zones will be recognized as sovereign civilian regions under Assembly Protection Statutes. Murmurs. Immediate. Because this was not a request. It was a restructuring. Celine didn't pause. In return, the Terran government will establish regulated transit corridors through Ashfall space, open to all Assembly members under equal access terms. That hit differently. Elias saw it. Delegates leaning forward. Attention shifting. Interest. Not fear. Opportunity. These corridors, Celine continued, will operate independently of existing karate-controlled relay networks. There was the second move. The real one. June blinked slowly. Oh. Ross didn't look at him. Now they're listening, he said quietly. Celine let the implication settle. No accusation. No direct challenge. An alternative. Access rates will be standardized, she said. Transit restrictions will be eliminated. All member species will operate under identical conditions. No favoritism. No hidden leverage. No dependency. The chamber reacted. Not loudly, but deeply. Because this wasn't just about Ashfall anymore. This was about trade. About movement. About control. Celine's voice remained steady. The assembly was created to maintain balance, she said. This framework restores that balance, legally, economically, and operationally. She stopped there. Didn't over-explain. Didn't push. Because she didn't need to. The offer was already doing the work. At the upper tiers, conversations broke out again, but this time, they weren't uniform. They weren't aligned. They were divided. 2 karate-aligned delegations requested immediate recess. Granted. The chamber dimmed slightly as internal consultations began. June leaned toward Elias. They didn't expect this. Elias shook his head once. No, he said. They expected resistance. June glanced at the projection again. This isn't resistance. Elias's eyes remained on the chamber. No, he said. It's replacement. The session resumed 40 minutes later. And the shift was visible. Not dramatic, but undeniable. One of the karate-aligned delegations spoke first. Carefully. We are prepared to consider the proposed framework, pending minor adjustments. Another followed. Clarifications regarding corridor management would be required. Translation. We're not rejecting this. The remaining karate block members did not agree. They issued formal objections. Placed on record. But contained. They did not escalate. That mattered more than the objection itself. Because it meant one thing. They were not willing to push further. The vote was called. Faster this time. Not rushed. But decisive. One by one. Affirmative. 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 A few no votes. Expected. Contained. The final count appeared. 38 in favor. 3 against. The framework passed. Not perfectly. But solidly. More than enough. Celine sat down. No smile. No visible satisfaction. Just a small exhale. Work completed. June leaned back in his chair, staring at the projection. Did we just win? Ross closed his console. We just changed the rules, he said. Elias said nothing. He was watching the chamber. Watching the way delegates moved now. Watching who approached whom. Watching who avoided eye contact. Watching who looked at the Terran table differently. Not as outsiders. Not as a problem. Something else. Something more careful. More deliberate. More respectful. Across the chamber, a small gray-skinned delegate descended from the mid-tier levels and approached Celine's position. Slowly. Hesitantly. Ambassador Ward, she said, her translated voice soft. Celine looked up. Yes. The delegate paused. When you walked out, were you certain this would be the outcome? June turned slightly, listening. Elias did too. Celine considered the question. Not quickly. Not casually. Then she said, no. A small silence. The delegate frowned slightly. Then how did you proceed? Celine's expression didn't change. But something in her voice did. Not stronger. Just clear. We didn't wait to be certain, she said. The delegate held her gaze. Processing that. Then nodded once. And stepped away. Elias watched her go. Then looked back at the chamber. At the central table. At where they were sitting now. Not assigned. Not granted. Taken. And kept. For the first time since arriving, the Crown of Nations didn't feel like a place where they didn't belong. It felt like a place that had adjusted. To make room. The chamber did not celebrate. That was not how victories worked here. There were no raised voices, no visible relief, no public acknowledgement that something significant had just shifted. The assembly moved forward exactly as it always had. Measured, procedural, controlled. But the difference was there. Subtle. Everywhere. Delegates no longer spoke around the Terran table. They spoke to it. Not all. Not openly. But enough. The session closed with formal language, confirmation of record, acknowledgement of objections, procedural sealing of the newly ratified framework. The arbiter's voice remained unchanged throughout, as if the outcome had been inevitable all along. Perhaps, Elias thought, that was part of the illusion. History here was never rewritten, only absorbed. One by one, delegations began to leave. The chamber emptied in slow, deliberate motion. Celine remained seated until the movement had thinned. Ross reviewed the final recorded terms one last time, then powered down his console. June leaned back in his chair, staring upward at the fading projection grid. So that's it, he said quietly. Celine stood. Yes, she said. June frowned. Just yes. She smoothed the front of her coat, the same small gesture she had made before walking out days ago. This part is done. Elias rose beside her. He didn't feel triumph. Not exactly. Something steadier. Something earned. Across the chamber floor, a few delegates paused as they passed. Some inclined their heads slightly. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Different reactions. Same cause. Recognition. Not admiration. Not friendship. But awareness. And in a place like this, that was enough. Elias was the last to leave the chamber. He paused just inside the doorway. Turned once, briefly, to look back. The central table. The tiered seating. The place where a decision had been made against them. And then undone. Not erased. Replaced. He let the image settle. Then turned and walked out. Beyond the sealed corridors of the crown, space opened again. Cold. Silent. Uninterested in the arguments of those who moved through it. In high orbit above Orinth, the Terran 3rd Deployment Group remained in position, its formation steady, its signal markers visible across every registered channel. They had not moved during the sessions. They had not needed to. Admiral Cade Wren stood on the command deck of the lead vessel, watching the incoming transmission as it resolved on the central display. Authorization code. Final. He read it once. Then again. Not because it was unclear. Because it marked an ending. He handed the data slate back to his operations officer. Signal all units, he said. Prepare for return transit. No urgency. No tension. Just execution. The fleet did not break formation immediately. It shifted slowly. Thousands of vessels adjusting vectors in perfect coordination, their running lights turning in the dark like a constellation rearranging itself. Then one by one, they moved. Not toward conflict. Not toward confrontation. In the Ashfall corridor, life had not paused. It couldn't. Water still needed recycling. Harvest cycles still needed timing. Machinery still needed repair. On one of the outer settlements, a world of rust-colored soil and thin, silver-leafed vegetation, Mara Ellen stood outside the operations hub, staring up at the sky. The news had reached them hours ago. Not through official channels. Through the same feeds everyone used. The same footage. The same moment replayed again and again. The walkout. The silence. The refusal. And then, the follow-up. The agreement. The corridors. The recognition. She had watched it twice. Then turned the screen off. There had been work to do. There was always work to do. Now, as the late cycle light dimmed across the horizon, the sky above the settlement cleared. Cloud cover thinning. Stars appearing. One at a time. Mara slipped her hands into the pockets of her worn jacket and stood there, still, watching. Behind her, the colony moved quietly, generators humming, distant voices, the low rhythm of a place that had been built from nothing and intended to stay that way. A transport pilot passed nearby and slowed slightly. "You see it?" he asked. Mara nodded. Far above, faint points of light shifted. Moving. Not approaching. Not threatening. Leaving. "The fleet's heading back," he said. Mar didn't look away. "Yeah," she said. The pilot hesitated. Then nodded once and kept walking. Mara stayed where she was. Watching until the lights grew dimmer. Until the sky returned to what it had been before. Open. Unclaimed. The way it had been when the first ships arrived. The way it had been when they decided to stay. She exhaled slowly. Not relief. Not quite. Something quieter. Something deeper. Behind her, the colony lights flickered on one by one. Ahead of her, the stars held steady. They always did. But somewhere between those two things, something had changed. Not the sky. Not the ground. The understanding. Who got to decide what happened here? Mara stood there a while longer. Then turned. And walked back toward the settlement. Far above, beyond the reach of atmosphere and light, the last Terran vessels cleared the orbital boundary and slipped into transit. Their signals remained visible for a moment longer. Then vanished. The Crown of Nations continued its silent orbit. Unchanged. At least from the outside. Inside, the record had been updated. A new framework. A new corridor. A new precedent. Not written as a revolution. Not announced as a shift in power. Just entered, filed, accepted. But the effect would ripple outward in ways no document could fully contain. Because for the first time in a very long time, a species had been told to yield, had proven itself right, had been overruled anyway, and had refused to accept the outcome. And instead of being removed, it had forced the system to adjust. Quietly, completely, irreversibly, and across the galaxy. Those who had watched, those who had hesitated, those who had voted one way while thinking another, were already asking themselves the same question. Not about the Ashfall corridor. Not about the resolution. Something simpler. More important. What happens next? When the rules stop working the way they used to?